It's time to get started, so take a seat. It's the Science Café, brought to you by OEB.
All right, everybody, welcome to OEB Science Café. So we are a group of graduate students from UMass Amherst, and we're here to bring our science and research from the UMass community out into the public. And so how it works is we're going to have 3 short vignettes and time for questions in between each one. And we're here today primarily due to some great funding sources, including our own programs, so the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass, as well as the UMass Graduate Student Senate, the UMass Graduate School, and the National Science Foundation. So a big thank you to all of them. We do have a disclaimer that we have people taking pictures and taking video of our cafe, so if you don't want to be involved in the pictures of the video, please go and speak to them. Jake's standing up in the back, he's taking pictures, and Aaron's over there on taking film. Last but not least, we have a great event coming up next month. So we have another cafe that's going to be entitled Super Soils, Why Dirt is Key for a Greener Planet. It's going to be a panel of graduate students who are all doing soil-based research. It should be really exciting. And immediately following that, we have Science After Dark, which is an end-of-the-year celebration. We're inviting back all of our speakers from the whole year, and we're going to have some drinks and some snacks and a chance to talk more one-on-one with some of our speakers. So it should be really a great event. So yeah, with that, I'd like to thank Ezra Markowitz for being here with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to your current position?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. So my name is Ezra Markowitz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass up the road. I've been here at UMass for 4 years, and I'm one of the few behavioral scientists in my department, or social scientists. I did my PhD, and actually my undergraduate work and my master's work was all at the interface of psychology and communications and sustainability. And it was actually, you want a little bit of background, right? So,
yeah, totally.
Okay, so I'm good at talking, so she's going to have to cut me off. It's part of this job is to talk. So when I was an undergraduate at Vassar College, I knew that I was going to do psychology. I was really interested in how people think, how people make decisions, why people do the things that they do. Right? Those were the questions that I was interested in. And then I had this other half of my life, which was running like the green the green group, the environmental group on campus, being outdoors all the time. And it was about halfway through being an undergraduate when this awesome mentor of mine, Ray Cornelius, who's a social psychologist, said, "Hey Ezra, there's a field that marries conservation and psychology. It's called conservation psychology. And actually it also gets called environmental psychology or sustainability psychology, all different flavors of the same field." So that was in my junior year. It was like it was an epiphany. He said, "There's this whole new field. People are really excited about it. Why don't you do work there and you can combine your 2 interests?" So that was the start. It was all the way back at Vassar, my junior year. And so I kind of shifted my direction. I dropped one of my extra majors and I focused a lot on bringing together the psych and the environmental stuff. And then from there I went on to graduate school where I could really do the 2 together at Oregon.
Great. So to sort of jump right into the content side of things, it seems like we're completely inundated with all these big, complicated, and highly politicized issues like gun control or climate change. So why is it so hard to talk about these big issues? And what are some of the factors that complicate those conversations?
Okay, not a small question to start. So somebody's doing slides for us, right? Yeah. Okay, so go to the next slide. Twice. Okay, so if I asked everybody in the room to turn to the person next to them and talk about one of these issues for a few minutes, you'd probably be okay doing that. Some of you might not know much about any of those topics, right? But you wouldn't get that uncomfortable if I asked you to talk to the stranger next to you for a couple minutes, right? And if you can push again, this is a little bit hard, but what these issues have in common, and others like them, is that they're not polarized in American society. In fact, many issues, most issues when it comes to science, technology, risks that we might face, societal decisions that we have to make collectively, are not polarized. That's the norm. Click the next button. Okay? But if I asked you to turn to the person next to you and have a short conversation about one of these issues, and if you're from Amherst, definitely the last issue might be the most contentious, the one that you might get, your hands might get a little sweaty, right? You might break out in a cold sweat. You might get anxious just thinking about having to have a conversation with somebody, with a stranger, somebody whose position you don't necessarily know on this issue, with one of these issues, right? So what's different about these ones? These are polarized issues. These are highly polarized issues in the US. In Amherst, obviously town charter, nobody else cares about town charter, but we care about town charter here, whichever side you're on, even though this vote was already behind us, right? So these are highly polarized issues in the US. And it turns out that just thinking about a polarized issue, a contentious issue, makes us anxious. And just thinking about having to talk with somebody when we don't know if they're going to share our opinion on it or not, makes us anxious. And that leads us to actually shut down. It turns out that people don't talk about these issues very frequently. So climate change, for example, which we'll talk more about today, and a topic that I've done a lot of work on, less than 1 in 5 people has a regular conversation with somebody else about climate change in the course of their daily lives. So most of us, most of the time, aren't talking about contentious issues. And yet we're inundated with information about these, right? And so the question for us is to try and understand where this polarization came from, and then I think eventually what might we be able to do about it. Can you click the next button? Okay, so one thought, and this is the one that comes to mind naturally for a lot of us, especially if you have a background in science, if you've been in the education system for a long time, right? Just if you are an educated person in particular, something that comes to mind is this idea of the knowledge deficit, which is, well, maybe we disagree because some people have more information than others, right? So people just have differential information, some are more knowledgeable, and that's where these disagreements come from. And if only everybody kind of knew the same things, we would agree. How many times have you probably thought that in your own mind? If only that person knew what I know, they'd believe the same thing as me. You could probably, again, think about town charter. You might have that thought. Climate change, too, or lots of other contentious issues. So this is a prediction, right? This is something that we could actually test. As social scientists, as somebody who goes out and collects data on what people think about issues, how people think, what they're actually doing in their own lives. This is a prediction that we could test. So assume that the blue line is Democrats or liberals, and red is Republicans or conservatives, or switch it. It doesn't really matter. One assumption is that as people's information, their knowledge about an issue goes up, their beliefs about an issue should come together, right? Because now they've got more information. So more knowledgeable people should be more similar. You go to the next slide. Not a big surprise, perhaps, because I set that up. That's actually not what it looks like on polarized issues. So on all those issues where there's not so much political disagreement, all those ones on the first slide that I showed you, where the kind of scatter plots were all over the place, there's no clear line between being a Republican and believing something, being a Democrat and believing something. On all those issues, more information sometimes changes how people think about an issue, but sometimes it doesn't. On these polarized issues, what we see, for example, on climate change, is that at the bottom left, or here on the left side of this figure that I have up here, these are people who don't have a lot of knowledge about science. But we could also replace what's on the bottom with basically how educated people are, how much they just know about things in the world in general. So on that left side, Republicans and Democrats, when we ask them, do you think climate change is a risk? Are you worried about it? Is it happening? Is there evidence? Is it something we need to do something about? Any of those questions, people who don't have a lot of knowledge, they actually, Republicans and Democrats, they look the same in their responses. And if folks are interested in knowing, roughly 50–60% of Americans, especially in the kind of lower education, lower knowledge side of the scale, think that climate change is a problem. So we're above a majority of Americans think that climate change is a problem in this case. But what you see is that as that knowledge goes up, as we start looking at the opinions or the attitudes of people who actually are more knowledgeable about science. So this is a measure of science literacy. That's where we see the most polarization. So on the issue of climate change, Democrats or liberals who have a lot of knowledge, who are just kind of very science literate, they're very concerned about climate change. They really see it as a big risk. Conservatives, people who identify as conservative, go the opposite direction. So the most educated conservatives are the least concerned about climate change in the US. Okay, so we get this polarization.
Can I jump in and ask how you measure something like scientific literacy? Because that seems like a complicated thing to quantify.
Great question. So there's a couple different ways. The National Science Foundation has a set measure that they've been using for many years to try and get at people's knowledge of basic scientific facts. Some people have said that's not the greatest measure. It's biased against people who are religious because it asks questions like, is the theory of evolution true or not? Right? And so you might say one thing based on what you've learned in class, but another thing based on what you learned in church on Sunday. Okay, so there's the Nsf Indicators, and those are used really widely. The researcher who's actually, some of this data comes from, Dan Kahan, who's down at Yale, has come up with other ways of measuring science literacy, science knowledge that get around some of these identity problems. And even with something like evolution or climate change, adding to a question, is there evidence of climate change? Just saying, do most scientists believe that there's evidence of climate change? Allows everybody, regardless of their ideological perspective, to reflect whether or not they know the state of the knowledge. So this kind of science comprehension, science literacy measure asks about lots of different issues, not just climate change. In fact, it's about other issues.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep.
So if it's not just a lack of information, where do these disagreements come from?
Okay, so what we're seeing here, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so click one more time. So again, this is another demonstration, right? Here's a specific question, and we see that people's responses to, is there solid evidence that climate change is happening, differ as a function of both political party or ideology, but also this kind of science knowledge question. So the question is, where does this come from? And the answer is right here, which is that in addition to, there's an information component to the disagreements that we have about scientific issues in this country, climate change and others too. There are very clearly, and have been for many years, very intentional campaigns to sow doubt and misinformation, primarily by fossil fuel companies. And that is really well documented at this point in books like Merchants of Doubt, which many people in the room may have read or know about. But it turns out that doesn't account for everything that's going on. And a lot of what's going on is that an issue like climate change and all those polarized issues, what it means to say something about your belief, is it happening or not, are you worried about it or not, has become tied up in who you are. So it's no longer just about what you know, about the science, about your science literacy, but it's also a reflection of, I'm a conservative, or I'm a liberal. And over the past 20, 30 years, but especially over the last 10 years, it's become very clear to people, especially people who are high media consumers, so people who pay a lot of attention to media, people who are, and that tends to be people who are more highly educated and people who are more science literate. You've started to learn by listening to the news what your side is supposed to believe about climate change. And so we see this polarization comes out of polarization amongst what we call elites or political leaders. And it turns out it's not just, there's a new study actually just came out by Neil Steinhaus and some others, another social scientist who works on this, that found that it's not just about kind of our psychology and our ability to ignore facts that are in front of us, but actually that a lot of polarization, especially on climate change, was driven by Democratic leaders saying this is an issue that's really important to us. And when Democrats, like Al Gore, said that this was an important issue to us, what did that signal to everybody else? It's not an issue that should matter to us. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing here. There's another piece too, though, and this is like, well, but what about? So here's the what about response that I often get, and I don't know if we're allowed to let people talk or hold anything to the end. But one what about that I often hear when I say that is, but there's so much evidence, right? All the evidence that suggests, if you look at what climate scientists, actual climate scientists, reputable climate scientists say, all the evidence says that climate change is happening. So another thing that's going on with this particular issue that we found a lot, and that really intersects a lot with the work that I do as a psychologist at core, is that this is not an issue that's right in front of us. Right? This is not something that smacks us in the face every day for the vast majority of us, particularly in developed countries like the US. So this is an abstract issue. It's not concrete. And so that means all these other kinds of cues that we need to rely on to figure out what we should believe about this issue start to play a bigger role.
Great. So I think we've covered pretty much everything that we had for the first section. Are there any questions at this point from the audience?
I would disagree with that last statement. I think it does smack us in the face every day. It's just people ignore it. Winters are colder, storms are bigger. It's everywhere in the country. And it does hit everyone all the time. People just don't pay attention to it. How can you say it's not hitting us in the face every day?
So I think this is a really good point. So very recently, like within the last year or two, things have probably shifted in terms of the salience of this issue, right? So how much it does kind of hit us. And even people's willingness to ignore it, or their ability to ignore it, actually I think has also gone down somewhat. So I actually would agree with this, with this statement that it's becoming harder and harder to ignore because it's becoming less and less abstract. But for a long time it was quite an abstract issue. And for many of us, even the colder winters are still something that many of us are still buffered against, right? It's kind of annoying that it's still snowing on April 10th in Amherst, right? But that hasn't fundamentally changed what I'm doing. I haven't planted things in my garden, but to be honest, I wasn't going to plant things anyways because I have a 2-year-old and we're not doing that this year. So I would agree that the impacts are no longer 30 years away, right? That's like a line that we've been hearing, but actually some of that is true. And as that shifts, we may see some changes in how people respond to this issue. On the other hand, the politicization that we've seen on climate change has actually only gotten worse over the last 2 years, and I think that's largely due to the fact that politicization in the U.S. has gotten worse over the last 2 years since the 2016 election. So you have these countervailing forces. You have what's in front of you, and you also have kind of what we're told to believe, what kinds of information sources people get information from, and in case folks didn't know, people at least on the far left and the far right in the U.S. these days live in pretty different information environments, like almost not overlapping at all in terms of the kind of factual information that people come into account with. So that means that personal experiences with extreme weather events, for example, to the extent that people think about them as tied to climate change, may have an impact. But even there, some of the work that's been done in this field suggests that conservatives and liberals interpret the exact same event in very different ways. Right? So a hurricane is interpreted as a sign of climate change by the left, but not by the right. And so it's to be seen how those kind of interacting complex dynamics play out. But it's an excellent point, well taken.
Another question?
Yeah, I'm just curious about how the rest of the civilized developed countries, they mostly embrace the idea of climate change. And here we are, we're mired in this conflict between left and right.
Why?
Why?
A couple things. So one, climate skepticism certainly seems to have started or is strongest in the US, tends to be actually fairly strong in most Anglophone countries. So US, UK, Canada, Australia all have some kind of divide on climate change. I am not a political scientist, at least not by training, so there are probably lots of different reasons for why climate change seems to be taken more seriously at a policy level in other countries rather than the US. Part of that explanation comes, at least from what I've read, comes from our somewhat unique two-party system as opposed to multi-party systems. So there's different stakes for engaging on particular issues, and so that's one explanation. It does seem like the U.S. was kind of ground zero for those intentional efforts to sow doubt about climate change. It's also the home of, many climate scientists and where a lot of the scientists come from. So yes, I think there's been more going on doing something about climate change in other countries, but actually some of these same dynamics are playing out in other countries.
In the back.
Also, to just kind of piggyback on what was said, wouldn't it be kind of a cultural thing too that Europe is more of a commuter country as opposed to where we're all about like big vehicles and that's like burning fossil fuels? I mean, that's just like an aspect of it. Culturally, there's just so much more commuting in Europe, which is also big.
Yeah, so there may be, one of the things that we as social psychologists think about is something called motivated reasoning, which is this idea that we kind of conform our beliefs about particular issues, whether it's climate change or anything else we might be talking about. Or when we go out and seek information, we want it to conform to kind of what we already want to believe. Everybody does this. Doesn't matter if you're an American or from any other country. But we might have some conditions in the US, like just very strong car culture, kind of individualism streak, which runs across the left and the right in the US in different ways from some other countries. That might play into that, which is like how motivated reasoning plays out in the US is to, downplay support for certain kinds of climate-friendly policies. But I suspect there's lots more going on besides that as well.
Yeah.
You brought up an interesting example of Al Gore kind of adding to the politicization of climate change, and we've seen other polarization happening with like free trade and Donald Trump changing which parties feel certain ways about free trade. And I'm curious if we can imagine climate change be repolarized if you just have the right person in the right party try to change the conversation. Could we imagine this graph switched where climate change becomes a conservative cause and the liberals are the ones saying that's an attack on our identity to do anything about climate change? Now, how much of this is about leaders and individuals?
It's a good question. Could you get a full flipping? I don't know. There have been some studies done, some really interesting work done, where if we frame this, one of the solutions to climate change is more regulation, get more of this polarization, because some more regulation of like power plants, let's say. Liberals, Democrats tend to support regulation of polluting industries. Conservatives not so much, because they believe in the market to try and weed out bad actors. But if we flip and we say that one of the solutions to climate change is more nuclear power, so it turns out that a lot of people on the left in the US don't like nuclear power for other reasons that may be fully legitimate or not. We won't have to talk about that right now. But when we say that the solution to climate change is more nuclear power, all of a sudden liberals become a little bit less concerned about climate change, and conservatives think that it's more of a problem because they tend to be supportive of nuclear power. So there is some of this, like, on the solutions side, that how solutions to an issue are framed, whether it's climate change or others, can start to move these lines in different directions, for sure. Could we get a wholesale flipping if President Trump tomorrow said, we're back in Paris and we're going to make it better, and climate change is the #1 issue facing our country right now? I don't think we would get a flipping. I think we would get a lot of surprise. And I think we would get a lot of positive action.
One more question, then we'll move on. Yeah.
You said something a few minutes ago that confuses me. You said this is supposed to be showing that misinformation isn't a big factor, but a few minutes ago you said that conservatives and liberals have very different information that they get through the news and the media. That would support the misinformation thing, not negate it.
Sorry. So that's a little bit of lack of clarity on my side for putting these slides together a little bit last minute. One thing that I want to point out here is if you look at what that x-axis is, which is kind of people's general knowledge or their science literacy, that's not a great explanation. In terms of why you get this splitting between the Dems and the Republicans at the highest levels of education or science literacy, in part is because not only do you get different information, so you do get misinformation, right? So you have different information, but also people who are better at working with information in general are better at incorporating that and kind of reinforcing their strong
And
beliefs.
manipulating for their own cause.
Yes, so there is, for sure, sorry. So that's, again, lack of clarity. Thank you for the great point. There's a role for misinformation in causing that spread.
People who don't believe climate change tend to listen to Fox News as opposed to other things.
Correct, that's definitely true. But also that people who are more highly educated, education, for example, doesn't defend against that. It actually seems to push people further apart, in part because they're better able to incorporate that information, correct or incorrect.
Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about why these conversations are difficult, can we talk a bit about the best way to engage in them if we do decide to do that? So how can we be more effective when discussing climate change with someone who's not of the same opinion that we are about it?
I think you can go to the next slide. I don't know. Okay, that's fine. That's good. So how do we make this happen? Right? This This is the question, right? On these uncomfortable issues, whether it's climate change or other things. And this is something that I've thought a lot about and done a lot of research on in my lab and also in other groups, trying to figure out how do we have these difficult conversations. And there are a few things that we think we've learned about how to make them a little bit easier and a little bit less like cold sweat inducing. One, and I think in some ways this is the most important for people who are very ardent proponents on any issue, but let's stick with climate change, is to go into difficult conversations not with the default being I need to persuade the other person, but that I want to have a conversation. And I think we're good at tricking ourselves into thinking that, yeah, no, I want to have a real conversation and dialogue, but in fact what we're really trying to do is persuade. And it's just, that's not necessarily a bad goal in some ways, right? It's laudable to want to try and help somebody think the way that you do. That's really natural. We do this all the time, trying to persuade each other. But on these really polarized issues, it's a really tough way to start a conversation, or even to have that as the frame of like, what are you trying to get out of it? And so oftentimes actually my first suggestion is to even just rethink, like, what's the goal of having a difficult conversation? So when you want to have a conversation with somebody who you think might not believe the same thing as you on climate change or evolution or whatever topic, Amherst Town Charter, what's the goal of having that conversation? And is it a reasonable and kind of defensible one, and something that's actually achievable? So that's kind of the first place that I would start.
Okay. So what's a better goal?
So not only in terms of goals, so in terms of what to do, I think a really important place to start is to listen. That when you go into conversations with people on difficult topics, and you suspect, you may not know, but you suspect maybe that person doesn't have the same opinion as you, that a really important place to start is by listening, to actually want to know. If you want to be productive, you want to actually have a conversation, is to hear what the other person's saying, which can be really hard when the other person says something that you think is totally BS, right? And you think it's ridiculous what's coming out of somebody's mouth. It's really hard to listen. But the goal of listening is not just to listen for listening's sake. The goal of listening is to try and understand where somebody's coming from. It's to try and understand some of these dynamics that we were just talking about, right? To understand that what people believe about climate change, what they believe about gun control, again, town charter, sometimes is tied up, oftentimes, in our identities, in our sense of who we are, or the groups that we belong to. And that's a really important place of understanding to start from if we actually want to have dialogue with people, if we actually want to talk with them, as opposed to talking past each other. It's really easy to talk past each other. You've all done that. I've certainly done that in my life. But one of the ways that we avoid that is to try and actually listen to what the other person's saying and reflect on why they're saying it and use that as a starting point. A couple other kind of more concrete things on climate change. The evidence, the kind of scientific evidence and recommendations from folks in my field on whether to talk about local issues versus kind of the global aspects of climate change keeps going back and forth, because it turns out that different audiences need different things. At least in some places, certainly more in the UK, there's mixed research in the US, but people who tend to be on the left side of the ideological spectrum like to think about climate change in global terms. They like, it's not uncomfortable necessarily for them to think about the global implications of this issue. Whereas it seems to be more comfortable, easier to grasp the issue and start talking about it productively if we think about it as a local issue for folks on the right. And there was actually a piece that was just out in the New York Times yesterday on localizing conversations. I don't know if anybody saw that piece. If you type in localize on the Times website, there was an op-ed yesterday. It's really interesting on how it's really hard to have these big conversations about kind of federal policy on issues that are polarized, but actually much easier to have conversations about, like, what do we do about the potholes in Amherst, right? And that's, okay, it's not climate change, but it's actually, it's a starting point for having conversations with people who we otherwise don't get along with. And the other thing in addition, so that's kind of the localizing can really help for getting people engaged as a starting point before we go big. The other side of that is to keep things concrete. And part of keeping things concrete, and this also goes back to listening and like figuring out what are the goals, particularly for people who have expert knowledge, is to know what decisions, what needs the person who you're trying to talk with or the group you're talking with actually have. So if I'm going down to talk to people on the coast in Massachusetts, I know, because I've thought about them a little bit, that they really need to make decisions about, do I rebuild my house after the last storm? Do I build it higher or not? What are my options, right? Those are starting points. Those are like really concrete decisions that they have to make. We all have those kinds of concrete decisions that we need to make in our lives. Those are starting points for us to be able to talk with people to say, okay, so here's what this is what I know about the issue and how it's influencing these kinds of decisions that you need to make tomorrow for the next 5 years. And that tends to be a much easier conversation to have than, you're wrong, climate change is happening, or climate change isn't happening, why are you being so dumb about this? Right? That's not a great way to have conversations go well.
Okay. I want to go back to that idea of like listening, because I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that one side is more likely to listen than the other. And yet we do see that there are some issues that are politicized that the left disagrees more with scientific understanding. For example, like vaccines and climate change, that the extreme left and the extreme right are both sort of hard of hearing when it comes to certain topics anyways.
Yeah, so the most recent big studies on this idea of motivated reasoning that were really good at kind of taking information and incorporating into our existing beliefs rather than updating our beliefs when new information comes in, it's an affliction for the left and the right, okay? From the most recent evidence that came out, to equal degrees. It's something that affects people on the left and the right. Which means that kind of the other thing that I often recommend, especially when I'm talking with like climate scientists or practitioners, people who are out kind of interacting with the public, but who have expert knowledge, is to be humble and to recognize and to show that humility as a starting point, because it keeps you more open. Even if you know you're not going to be persuaded by the person that you're talking with, that's okay. But to come from that place of humility, I think very much can help with this this problem of incorporating information in ways that are biased.
Great. So the last question I have for this section is about not wanting to engage or making the decision to disengage from a conversation that's spiraling out of control and seems like it's not headed to a positive or constructive place. Do you have any strategies on how to get out of that kind of a difficult conversation without really conceding on your values or yeah?
We could have somebody from the audience try and encourage me to leave the stage. I don't know that I have great strategies for that. I think you can listen, you can be humble, you can really try to understand where somebody's coming from without wavering on your values and your identity and who you are at all.
Yeah.
You don't need to necessarily change your mind. That's not what those things mean. And sometimes you can't get from that initial conversation to actual dialogue. And that's how it is.
Yeah.
On climate change, again, this is the issue that I know the most about in the U.S. On climate change, about 8 to 10% of the U.S. Are what we might call just absolutely dismissive on the issue of climate change. And you have a roughly similar number, 12 to 15%, who are kind of on the other far end. They're like really gung-ho activists on climate change. Everybody else is in the middle. Everybody else has some level of uncertainty, some level of interest. Most people, it turns out, don't care that much about climate change. It's a way down at the bottom of the list of things that people care about in this country. And so there's some people that you won't have conversations with on that issue or on any particular issue. And it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to have a productive conversation. That's okay. That's still 80% of the public, 75, 80% of the public on a lot of issues that are in that middle. People who can be open-minded. And I think that's a good place to start.
Definitely. All right, we'll open it up for audience questions again. Yeah.
So when you mentioned about Al Gore, it made me start to think about how we often view ourselves as part of one team, right? And then there's the other team that are clearly the opponents. It's kind of the biggest downside of the two-party system. When you're trying to have a dialogue with somebody about one of these issues, I feel like it's obviously detrimental if you come across as a member of the opposing team, right? Because then it doesn't matter what you say now, right? If you think about somebody from the opposing team shouting out like this fact, that fact, while you're you're already dismissing it because it's a member of the other team, I don't trust what they say, I don't like the people on the other side. Is there a way that people who have knowledge on the subject can talk with people without appearing as though I'm an opponent, a member of the other team?
It's really hard. In fact, when I talk with climate scientists again, one of the things that I say up front often is you're not the right messenger for everybody. Right? So there are certain communities that I'm just not the right messenger to talk about these kinds of things at all. And the same is true for all of you. And that can be a very tough lesson for people to hear. So part of effective communication at a larger scale on any issue, but particularly polarized issues, is finding the right messengers, people who are trusted, whether they're fully in-group members or they're just people who aren't, fully at the edges, or they're not immediately identified as kind of members of the other tribe, the other side. But one of the outcomes of that result is that not everybody can be the messenger for everybody else. I would also say that on almost every issue on which Americans are polarized, and I know the U.S. context the best, you can find a group of committed people who are from the opposite tribe, who are kind of trying to work from within. So on climate change, for example, there's a big group led by Bob Inglis called Republican, with an E-N at the end. Bob Inglis was a former congressman from South Carolina, I believe. Was voted out as soon as he kind of came out saying climate change was a problem, okay, but who's working very hard to create a voice on the right that's kind of pro-action on climate change. And you see similar things like Democratic groups on the left in terms of like gun rights and gun access or all sorts of issues. But yeah, it doesn't mean that everybody can talk to everybody else. One other quick point on that. So there are also, all of us also can hold kind of multiple identities, and we have different hats that we can put on. And so if you've got one of those group identities that does align with the group that you want to talk with, that is not immediately seen as the outsider, that's the one to put forth. That's the one to say, look, I'm not just a climate scientist, I'm an evangelical Christian as well. One of the most successful communicators of saying climate change is Katharine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist at Texas A&M, who's an evangelical Christian. She's married to an evangelical Christian pastor, and she has a fairly unique ability, because she has these multiple identities, to go talk at the big conference of climate scientists, and then the next day go talk at a big megachurch. I cannot go talk at a big megachurch, probably, but I accepted that a while ago. I saw a bunch of it.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about talking to people who you both believe in climate change, but not in how you would come to solutions, and it often involves behavioral change, which is very difficult for people.
Can you say a little bit more about who you have in mind?
Well, there are different solutions that have been proposed. Carbon taxes, that we need to give up driving as much, and for some people, you live far out, you're far away from your job, you're having to drive more. How do you broach that with someone? It's pretty personal.
Yeah, and actually I think
people believe in climate change.
Yeah, and so I think this will tie into
Yes,
the question, so I don't know how you want to.
You jumped the gun a little bit, because that's going to be the focus
gonna
of our
get to
next
that.
section. But if you want to start to answer it, that's okay.
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and it's part of a larger conversation on this issue of climate change. Like, what should we do? And how do we address it? Is this a top-down problem? Is this, you need policy change, you need technological development that can't happen at the individual level? Or do you need this kind of bottom-up changes in behavior and everyday kinds of things, electricity use, fossil fuel use? We'll get to a nice slide. Maybe it's even the next one, I don't know. So here we go, great. So, so here's one perspective, which is you can only solve this problem by changing the system, by changing technological systems, by changing the energy system, the economic system, and even that like efforts to try and get people to change their own behavior are counterproductive. So this is a strand here on the left, counterproductive because they discourage people from wanting to take kind of more radical actions, like asking for and demanding political change, but also counterproductive because they kind of distract people from what's really going on. And then you could click the next button. You've got other perspectives on the other side saying, actually, no, it's really important that people, that we have both sides of this, which is where I would come down on this personally, having looked at the research, which is that, yeah, we probably need some major systems and technological change and a lot of research and development on the energy system side to deal with climate change. But we also are probably very likely aren't going to get there without some significant behavioral change, bottom-up change from individuals, for a couple different reasons. One, if you go to the next slide, because there's just lots of pieces to reducing our carbon emissions, and it's really complex, and there's just so much that needs to happen to reduce carbon emissions sufficiently to deal with this issue. And that the behavioral side actually can happen really fast. So a lot of the stuff that I do in my lab, a lot of the work that we do is look at how people make environmentally relevant decisions, how people make decisions around energy use or transportation mode choice, things like that. And those are decisions that, under certain conditions, not everybody can change tomorrow, but actually lots of things can change very quickly. So it's called the behavioral wedge. But that some of those, that also won't get us all the way, right? So it's been estimated somewhere in the 10 to 20% of the reductions that we might need in greenhouse gases to really confront climate change over the next 50 years can come from that behavioral wedge, but that leaves everything else too. But it's also a difficult discussion to have for exactly this reason that you've raised, which is that not everybody can be asked or should be asked to reduce their emissions, their personal emissions, in the same way. And there's a really good ethical argument that the vast majority of people living on this planet right now should be allowed to increase their emissions, or at least increase their access to energy, because they're living in energy poverty. Right? Billions of people don't have the lights on at this time of the day. And it's really hard ethically and practically to ask them to reduce their emissions at all, as opposed to many people living in developed countries, but not everybody. So it's actually a really difficult conversation to have, and it's, again, where I would come from is kind of a position of humility, which is to recognize that people can make differential kinds of impacts and contributions, and that the person that lives 50 miles away from their job, because they're taking care of the elderly parents, that's a different situation than somebody who is choosing to live 150 miles out because they like being in the exurbs. And even there, it really gets into the weeds of who can be asked ethically and then practically to change their behavior and who shouldn't, and to what extent. But if you see the behavioral wedge as an important component to dealing with this problem, those are tricky issues that also have to be dealt with, in addition to how do we find ways to make the systems change happen. So I don't have a concrete how you resolve that issue. But there's a clear role for people that work on kind of ethics and climate change, which is a really vibrant, interesting field.
Great, thanks. So going off of that behavioral wedge component, up until now we've kind of focused on these external dialogues, right? Me talking to someone else. But I also feel like I'm constantly having this internal monologue about how to minimize my footprint, right? Do I spend the extra time to sort my recycling this morning, or am I too late and I gotta just dump it in the trash? And how can I make sure that I'm making good choices about my own behavior on a daily basis? Is there a way of doing that?
Yes, I think there's a way to make better decisions, but the calculus is not simple, and it does come back in part to this question, which is that there are implications that are very much climate-oriented, right? So the decision of, do you leave your lights on or not? Did you remember to turn them off? Do you go back the 5 minutes back to your house to get those lights turned off, or to turn your heat down, for example? That there's a practical question of, what's your contribution on the emission side, and leaving the lights on. If you've got all LEDs in your house, I'd say you probably shouldn't feel that bad about it today. Try not to do it in the future. If you left your house at 75 and you're gone for the next 48 hours on a trip, not as great when it's 20 degrees outside. So there's a practical accounting component, and there are tools online that you all could use. You get some feedback from your electric utility, EverSource. If you're in Amherst, you could get a lot more. If you have solar panels on your house, you might have a daily monitor. You have a monitor in your house, tells you exactly what's happening and what you get better feedback. So there are tools that we have to give people better feedback on the practical side. But then there's also these kind of bigger questions in terms of what our individual contributions are, what are the things you would do. So like economists often think in terms of opportunity costs. So and opportunity costs are not just money, right? But if you having to go back 10 minutes, or even just worrying, like the opportunity cost of worrying about your carbon emissions stops you from doing other things like making donations to really effective environmental organizations, or protesting on really important days, or going out for the march this weekend, right? Then there is a lost cost there, which is you've turned off your lights for whatever reason, but now you feel better about not going to the march, and maybe that is the more effective thing to do. And that's a very difficult calculus to make because I don't know how important it is that you go to a march on Saturday as opposed to turn your thermostat down. If you can increase your budget for things that are pro-climate, so again, not just your economic budget, but like your mind, your kind of psychological capacity to think about this issue, to worry about it, then you can worry about turning off your lights and go to the march, right? You can do all of them, but for some people, it's a real trade-off.
Yeah, totally. And so it seems like the behavioral wedge, like you were saying, is comparatively small. It can feel like we as individuals don't make much of a difference, particularly in the face of global economy and corporations and all that kind of thing. So is that true? And why should we try to foster good habits about sustainability when corporations and society as a whole make much more of an impact than I could as any one person?
It's a great question. So this is a really vibrant and ongoing debate within the kind of fields that I work in, kind of at the intersection of political science and environmental sociology and environmental or conservation psychology. Is how much does the individual matter, and are we being counterproductive or not when we ask people to make individual choices in their own daily lives? So yeah, when we look at the wedge up there, right, the behavioral component, the direct behavioral component is fairly small. Right, it's 10 to 20%, but actually all the other wedges are really small too. So if we look at agriculture, we look at energy system, we look at transportation, that's the whole idea of the wedge. You need all these different wedges to add up to the kinds of reductions that we're looking for. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the advantages of the behavioral wedge is that we actually, as consumers, have a lot of control over it. So yeah, not everybody can reduce their emissions immediately, and some people can reduce their emissions more than others through either easier or more difficult or cheaper or more expensive kinds of activities. But there's a lot that can be done there. So that's, I think, one reason to stick with on the behavioral side. Two, I don't think there's not good evidence that I've seen that getting people to make these changes actually in a meaningful way depresses their willingness to take other kinds of action, like civic action or political action. So I haven't seen that kind of evidence. It's very difficult evidence to collect. So that particular argument, I don't think holds that much water with me right now. I'm willing to update my belief on that if somebody else can show me that there's really good data. Third, there's in the system that we are all living in right now, right, a capitalist system, market system, there is clearly a role for consumers and consumer pressure to play. So not just at the individual level, like I change my habits and so that reduces my emissions immediately, but also that we see over and over again that collective consumer action can push large industries in new directions. And I think that's true on this front as well. So it doesn't mean that it can only come from the bottom up, right? And if you only have the bottom part, then you get other kinds of price signals or other things that if you don't also then have regulation and policy that comes in to hold positive changes in place, you get a lot of backsliding. So I think you need change to come from both sides.
So I have one more question, and then we'll take a break for audience questions one last time. How can we feel empowered that we are making a change and not leave tonight feeling kind of discouraged that we're never going to persuade anyone and that, that kind of thing? How do we leave feeling empowered and not weighed down?
Well, let me just take a little poll. How many people are feeling discouraged right now? Okay, so that's pretty good. I feel good about that. There's not too many hands going up. I know you can all see that. Okay, so something that I've learned about myself, especially since I had a child, is that I'm not the greatest pep talker. Okay, so when my wife needs a pep talk, I'm not always the greatest person to give a pep talk. So I don't know that I'm the best person to ask this question. On the other hand, I'm also not pessimistic necessarily on the climate front. I think we're learning more and more about, on the behavioral side and kind of on the policy and regulation side, we're learning a lot, both within academia and outside, what kinds of things might really help on this issue, including in terms of how do we have these difficult conversations with people, how do we get people to open up. So I think we're learning a lot there. We also are seeing some really tremendous positive movement on the technology side. And I think when you combine those two, even when there are lots of vested interests pushing back, that the arc of progress on climate change, I think, continues to be positive and sloping upwards. So I'm optimistic in that respect. And I would love for everybody, I mean, something that would make me feel really optimistic would be for everybody in this room to go out and try and have a difficult conversation. Whether it's about climate change or anything else, I actually just think it's a really good exercise. It's really hard to do, but if it's, if I were to give you all a goal for the rest of 2018, it would be to try and have a difficult conversation with somebody about either a local issue or something bigger, like climate change. And that usually that can build on itself. I think something else, I don't know if you'd asked it now, or some other point when we talked was, how would we know if we're successful or not, especially when it comes to having these kinds of conversations? Like, what metrics would you have to know? Well, one is like, if somebody came into a conversation with you and they clearly are on the opposite end of an issue from you, and you leave that single conversation and they're like, wow, you've completely changed my life. Okay, great. Is that going to happen that often? No. But if you leave open the door and you have another conversation with that person, as opposed to that's the only time that you interact with them, I would count that as a big win. And as a metric for whether or not you had a successful first encounter with somebody was, did you actually open up dialogue as opposed to, that was it. We tried and it failed. Sometimes they'll try and fail. But again, if you move away from persuasion to let's just keep going, I think that's a good metric of success.
Great, thank you. So yeah, right up front.
I have 3 quick points, actually. I've never understood these arguments about, is it more important to do personal behavior? Is it more important to do political action? I think on important things, you need to attack it from all fronts. There's no front that's not important.
Agreed.
My second point is that changing your own personal behavior does affect the large corporations. Because, for instance, if you're buying LED bulbs instead of incandescent bulbs, they're going to make more LED bulbs and less incandescent bulbs. If you're, buying a more fuel-efficient car, they're going to make more fuel-efficient or electric cars and less gas-guzzling cars. So personal behavior does affect the huge corporations, like you talked about before, the market.
So Ken, do you want to make a third point? Sure. So just on that point, I think part of the argument is not like you couldn't get there through the behavior change, but the argument is, wouldn't it just be a lot faster for the government to say, to have CAFE standards and say all the the fuel efficiency standards have to go up each year. So that's the regulation argument. It's like you get.
That's why you have to do both. And my third point is, I used to go on a peace pilgrimage every year between 1986 and 1990, and I did the petition. Every year we have a petition asking people to sign to get the government to reduce nuclear weapons and what and so I would constantly talk to people the whole way that we were walking for many days. And I would often run into people who completely disagreed with me, who were like ultra-conservative. And I found that 9 times out of 10, even if we didn't agree on the ultimate issue that I had brought up, like would you sign this petition, we moved closer together and found places where we overlapped and agreed with each other. And not all 9 times out of 10, but often the person who started out completely disagreeing with me would sign my petition anyway because we found a point of agreement.
Curious about, you've been talking about how to update other people's views or strategies that can help us get there eventually. What advice do you have so that we can be better at updating our own views when we're having conversations with people we really don't agree with, at least at the start?
Okay, so a couple like tried and true things. Everybody can hear me, right? This is one. So one of the reasons why, like when we encounter information that goes against what we believe or goes against some kind of pre-existing thought that we have in mind or even our values, We reject it because it's challenging, right? And it doesn't feel good to come into contact with information that is really uncomfortable. One tactic that people have come up with is something called self-affirmation, which is basically before you're going to have that kind of encounter, whether it's with somebody in a difficult conversation or like, okay, I'm going to check out what's happening on, if you're on the left, I'm going to check out what's happening on Breitbart today. If you're on the right, I'm checking out what's on Huffington Post today. But you can do a self-affirmation, which is kind of to affirm who you are and what your values are and your beliefs. And actually it turns out that allows you to encounter information that kind of would otherwise be very distressing in a little bit more of an open-minded way. Okay, so that's one strategy. We can also do that when we're in conversation with each other, which is part of, I think, probably what you do, which is you find common ground with people so that people are not on the defensive in the same kind of way. When it comes to conversations, especially with other people, one of the things that you don't want to do, even if you're looking for common ground, is to reinforce kind of misinformation or myths that they have in mind. And so we have these, very common for us is to start a sentence like, well, you might have heard this, that the sun is totally responsible for causing all of the heating that we've seen over the last 20 years. But let me tell you, it's actually this. That's a really, actually not a great way to start, not only because it can put people on the defensive, but also because you've reinforced the misinformation. So one of the things that's come out of the work on not just persuasion, but just kind of information updating, both for ourselves, but especially when we're talking with other people, is to try not to reinforce those myths and to be very clear about what the factual information is on a particular issue that we are trying to communicate. So those are a couple of things. I also personally, I would love for everybody to do this as well. I'll just tell you a little bit about my media habits. So every day, multiple times a day, probably more than I should, I check out New York Times, Breitbart, Fox News, Huffington Post, The Nation. I try to have a spectrum of information that I'm exposed to. And I, for some reason, continue to be surprised by how what I see in different events, just completely different events. And when there is something that every news outlet covers in this country, it is almost never covered the same way. It's almost always covered in completely opposing directions, different spin. But being exposed to that, I have a good sense of what other people are thinking. So it gives me a little bit of a leg up if I go into a conversation, a difficult conversation with somebody who comes from a different ideological kind of background, values background, to know what have they been exposed to. Oh yeah, it's totally reasonable to think that this is a hoax if you listen to this news source, because that's all you've heard, which comes back to a point that you said. And to know that, and to recognize that, again, with some humility about, oh, well, actually some of the things that I'm exposed to on the news sites that I used to only pay attention to maybe also are exaggerated or they're spun in a certain way, almost immediately starts to disarm you when you start to cultivate those kinds of media habits. So, Evan, I want you to start reading all the news, or none of the news, one of the two.
Okay, so I think we're right up against time. If anybody has any questions, maybe Ezra will hang out for a couple minutes.
I'm happy to stick around until I need to go put my child to sleep.
There you go. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for coming.